Today's message is about perseverance. Sylvester Stallone said, going in one more round when you don't think you can, that's what makes all the difference in your life. Shout out to our amazing counselors.
One more round, that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing, thank you. Best of luck, tennis, track, and swim. Best of luck today. Can't wait to see how many medals and how well we do with that. Also, boys basketball versus Plymouth tomorrow and boys soccer versus Bush tomorrow. So looking forward to lots of winning going on at the ranch. Please make sure you adhering to exactly what the expectations are. If you are choosing to post things on social media, if you are choosing to make bad decisions and start fights or start mess, then you're choosing not to be here at George Ranch High School. So please make sure you are choosing to be here. You are choosing to be kind, or you're choosing to be quiet. We love you and have a fabulous Friday.
All right. You guys know you have a paper due Wednesday, right? Yes? Okay. So the paper due Wednesday is the biography, same thing that you did first semester, except now your biography has to be over somebody in U.S. history post-Reconstruction. All right, as soon as the PowerPoint is up on the board there, we'll get started. But you've got a quiz today. You had a short response yesterday. I'm in the middle of grading AP essays, so I'm a little behind on your all short responses right now. I know that. I will hopefully finish the AP essays today. And then start catching up on your short responses over the weekend. Those are a little bit easier to grade than essays, obviously. Okay, so we are into Unit 2, which I think I titled Unit 2 Progressivism, didn't I? Yeah? Okay. Really what we're going to be looking at, or wait, it's progressivism and World War I, isn't it? Okay. So really what we're going to be looking at here, starting now, is, again, sort of twofold, the same twofold that we generally focus on in U.S. history. So one, what is going on domestically, and then two, what is going on internationally. Just a little preview for the unit here. Domestically, we have the beginnings of the progressive era, and progressivism is a direct result of some of the ills of industrialization, right? So once we created this market economy, this market economy was not without its flaws, and progressivism is going to attempt to address these various flaws. Okay? And then internationally, that's domestically. Internationally, the United States changes foreign policy at this point drastically. Okay? For the first 100 plus years of American history, the United States was very, very isolationist. Do we know what that word means? If I were to isolate you, what would I be doing to you? Putting you off all by yourself, right? Isolationism as a foreign policy is the same concept. Okay? So isolationism as a foreign policy concept is the idea that we're not going to get involved in other people's businesses. Now, we did have the Monroe Doctrine from the early 19th century that said we are in charge of, or we are we're going to oversee the Western Hemisphere, right? That Latin America, what we call Latin America today, is our responsibility. I actually think that this is a really good, like if you ever have to write a historical argumentative essay, I think American imperialism is a really, really good topic for American history. First of all, before we get into anything, do we know what imperialism is? So we would need to be able to define the term imperialism first. Imperialism is basically a foreign policy in which you create colonies or subservient territories that exist in order to further your goals, right? Your economic goals and your diplomatic goals and your like world power goals, right? So imperialism is sort of the foreign policy of creating an empire, right? Do we ever have an American empire? It's a loaded question. And I think honestly, you could argue it either way. Okay? There are a lot of people, generally on the left of the political spectrum, that would argue that American imperialism has existed for over 100 years and that it's evil and that it's terrible and the United States is like dictating foreign policy and things like that. I think that there's another whole ideology that doesn't really fit well on the political spectrum scale that would argue that at no point in time has the United States ever been imperial. We've not created sort of subservient colonies. We don't have colonies. And instead, we're simply existing in a global market and operating through globalism where, you know, countries are not isolated from one another. Now, at this time, there is a guy who wrote a book. The dude's name is up there on the board, Alfred Mahan. Okay? And Mahan's book becomes really significant, specifically to Teddy Roosevelt and William McKinley, right, who are presidents basically at the turn of the century. The two of them believe that if the United States is to exist as a world power, and we are not by any stretch of the imagination a world power in 1900, okay, like we're probably, we might not be top 10 in 1900, okay. Most of your power is still consolidated amongst European countries, and European countries are still predominantly imperial, where they have colonies throughout Africa and the Middle East and Asia. And then to a lesser degree, I mean, like Brazil is formerly Portugal, and you still have, bless you, you still have some Spanish influence in Latin America around this time. And, but the U.S. is going to build up its Navy because Mahan's theory basically says whoever has the strongest Navy in the world is the strongest power in the world, because obviously this is still before air travel, and therefore if you want to get anywhere, you have to have ships. And so the stronger your Navy is, right, the larger your Navy is, right, the more prominent you are on a global level, all right? So that's sort of the idea. And then when you look at sort of imperialist theory, right, again, we talked about social Darwinism. Some of it goes back to that, right? That sort of concept of survival of the fittest. If you got overtaken and you know, you became colonized by some superior power, well, that's really a you problem. And you should have fought a little harder. there's obviously a lot of arrogance that goes along with that, and predominantly like white arrogance at that point, because those are the people that are imperial, right? Around the turn of the 20th century, the United States is looking to expand west, meaning to expand specifically within the Pacific Ocean. We recognize at the beginning of the 20th century that China is a vast, vast, untamed market. And in reality, if you want to say that America is imperialist, like if that's your argument in a historical sense, and I don't know that it would be a bad argument, but if that's your argument, American imperialism is really sort of like capitalist imperialism. Okay? And do you understand like basic economics? Do you know how you make money as a country? You actually understand like basic economics? What do you want to do, Nico?
In order to make money as a country?
Yes.
Well, usually it involves like trade and like finished products.
Trade and finished products are key components, right? So what are you trying to do with the finished products?
Well, if you have the finished product, you usually sell them more than you bought the raw products for.
Okay.
That makes money.
So in terms of trade, you want to have a trade imbalance.
Which you want to be getting a better deal than the person you trade.
Well, obviously, but how do you get the better deal? And the way you get the better deal is that you export more than you import, right? So exports are products that are leaving the country. Imports are products that are coming into the country, okay? Now, in reality, you can be exporting just a boatload of raw materials, and that's actually fine. You can still make money that way if you're only importing a small amount of finished products, okay? But if you really want to do it and you really want to do it right, you want to try to export like everything, but especially finished products. So the real idea here is if you try to get rich, right, you want to make something, and you want to make something that you specifically know is crap. Like it's going to last 4 or 5 years, and then it's going to have to be replaced. So that way they keep buying more, right? Like y'all realize that the technology exists today to have light bulbs that last 100 years? Did you know that? Like seriously, we could make a light bulb that doesn't burn out for 100 years. Does GE make that light bulb? General Electric. It's a company that makes light bulbs, GE. No, they don't make that light bulb. Why do they not make that light bulb? Because you would only buy one of those from them in your entire lifetime. They don't like that idea. They want you to keep buying their light bulbs. Same with Philips, right? The reality is, I mean, in this day and age, dude, cars in America, you used to be able to keep a car for 300, 400,000 miles. You keep a car for 25, 30 years. Now, man, you lucky if your car lasts 8 years. Same thing with like refrigerators, right? Like everything that we make now, everything that we make, it all has that, 10-year, 100,000 mile warranty for automobiles, right? Oh, we got a 5-year warranty on this new refrigerator. Guess what? They literally design it to break after 5 years. Like the warranty is not like, oh, let's just pick a nice round number, like 5 years. No. The warranty is because we knew we built it like crap. It's going to last 5 years and that's it. And then you're just SOL. Okay. So the U.S. is expanding into the Pacific. We purchased Alaska in 1867. It's sometimes referred to as Seward's Folly. Seward was the Secretary of State under Lincoln and Johnson, right? So he's Secretary of State during the Civil War, obviously 1867. That's right after the Civil War. We bought Alaska from Russia, and dude, like, let me tell you what, man, people made that so much fun of that dude because they were like, oh, you just bought like wasteland, right? Like you just bought a frozen wasteland. Alaska has paid for itself like 50 times over. What?
Have you been to Alaska?
No, I've never been there. But the amount of natural resources that we got out of Alaska alone grossly exceeds the value of what we paid Russia for it.
Like, who bought Alaska again?
Seward, the United States. Right? I mean, Seward was Secretary of State, so he's the one that negotiated the deal.
Who was president?
Andrew Johnson at the time. And that's actually a picture of Johnson and Seward. And I mean, like literally that political cartoon right there is mocking them. Like it's a mockery. Like we were mocked for purchasing Alaska. Turns out to be a great thing. Samoa is an example of westward expansion into the Pacific, specifically for naval reasons, right? And Samoa's American territory now. But like the Philippines is going to be the same thing when we get into the Spanish-American War in 1898. Okay. The expansion into Hawaii, again, Hawaii is really an expansion for economic reasons. The Hawaiian Islands obviously are very tropical, right? They've got, all kinds of like fruit trees and, coconut, pineapple, mango, stuff like that. Hawaii is actually its own kingdom, right? It's its own country at the time. And the Dole Pineapple Company? Like, you go to the grocery store and you want to go buy pineapples, you go buy like Dole pineapples. Yeah, Dole is a family that went to Hawaii and sort of set up a business. And then through the power of that business, they basically overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and the actual like monarchy of Hawaii, right? And take over Hawaii, right? And put in like U.S. protectorates, right? And like a little puppet U.S. government. And then eventually Hawaii is annexed in 1898, where it becomes an official U.S. territory, right? But basically these white planters, with the help of U.S. Marines, overthrow this Hawaiian government, which is part of the reason why Hawaiians don't really like outsiders. If you go live in Hawaii and you are not Hawaiian, you are generally not that welcome. And by this point, we get to the Spanish-American War of 1898, and this is probably, if you're going to argue American imperialism, this is really what sort of starts American imperialism. So basically, one, you have Cuba's war for independence, right? So Spain is losing sort of control of some of its colonies, right? Spain is on the decline as a nation, or as a global sort of power. And so with yellow journalism, which is basically just like propaganda in the news, right? Like fake news is not a new thing. This existed 125 years ago. Okay. But you have U.S. newspapers that are advocating for war, that are pushing for war, that are creating sort of sensationalized stories about some of the ills that are going on and whatnot. And so ultimately the U.S. is going to get involved, and they're going to use the Monroe Doctrine as a part of it, right? And then we have the sinking of the battleship Maine in the harbor down in Havana, Cuba, which may or may not have actually been an act of war. But ultimately, it becomes a battle cry. And again, it's not the first time that we sort of utilize. It's not the first time or the last time that we use a suspect event as sort of the catalyst for war in order to get people on board, right? In the Mexican-American War in like 1848, right, around Texas, there was a whole, like, remember the Alamo, right, which is propaganda. And then there's a whole, like, issue as to where some battles were actually occurring, right? Like what side of the Rio Grande, and was the battle in Texas or was it in Mexico? And both sides are saying that the other side attacked them, right? Same thing here. You actually have an internal explosion on the USS Maine, which is probably a result of negligence, right? There was some sort of like,
But they use it to make it seem.
yeah, but then once the battleship goes down, like, oh, now like we were attacked by Spain, like this is war, we're going to go to war with Spain. And so ultimately we have like an official declaration of war, and it's sometimes referred to as this splendid little war. Teddy Roosevelt gains a lot of prominence at this point. Roosevelt was one of the Rough Riders who fought in Cuba. But as we go into war with Spain, it's not just Cuba. It's going to be almost a global war. And so we fight the Spanish in the Philippines as well, right? So the Philippines were a Spanish colony. If you don't know where the Philippines are, they're basically in Southeast Asia. So they're just, the map shows that they're sort of South China Sea. But it's a fairly important, I can never say this word, archipelago, chain of islands. Let's just use that term, right? Chain of islands. What? Yeah. Okay, chain of islands. It's fairly important because where it sits there in sort of like the South China Sea, it's off the Asian coast, right? It gives you access from the Philippines. You have relatively easy access into Asia and China. You have relatively easy access south into Australia. And it sits there sort of at the great opening of the Pacific Ocean. So it's ultimately a very, very significant territory. So obviously we fight in the Philippines. We also fight in the Atlantic or the Caribbean, really, between Cuba and Puerto Rico. And ultimately we get the Treaty of Paris in 1898 that ends the war. Spain backs down. But there's some fallout, right? And a couple of slides, I don't know why I probably should have moved it to a later slide. But the Teller Amendment and the Platt Amendments are significant in terms of the war and dictating policy and what the U.S. can actually do, right? So it's a pretty short war. Looks pretty good for the United States. I mean, we're victorious pretty easily. But that brings into conflict, what do we do with these sort of newfound territories, right? Like, what do we do with the Philippines? The Philippines, I mean, in reality, the Philippines were already engaged in war with the Spanish before we got there. They were fighting a war for independence when the United States began to fight Spain. Initially, the Filipinos actually welcome us, right? Like that sort of concept, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We fight alongside the Filipinos. Once we vanquish the Spanish and we're successful there, Spain pulls out. We don't really leave the Philippines. And ultimately, Emilio Aguinaldo, who is he's actually in that picture somewhere. I think he's the one seated there in the middle, maybe. I don't know. He's one. Yeah, he's somewhere in that picture. But he is. I mean, if you ask Filipinos today, Emilio Aguinaldo is like the George Washington of the Philippines, right? And so when the U.S. kicks the Spanish out, they think they've they've won. They've been successful. They're free. They're autonomous. But ultimately, the U.S. isn't quite ready to leave, right? The U.S. has their sights set on global expansion and being a larger global player. And so they need naval bases in the Pacific and things like that. But there's not necessarily there's significant opposition to that, right? There is the American Anti-Imperialist League, which doesn't want to see U.S. Sort of government intervention in foreign territories as a result. So with the Philippines specifically, we didn't have like the Philippine-American War because the Philippines thought that we were, going to help them, or that we did help them, right? That we got rid of the Spanish, and then they thought they were going to be autonomous, and we sort of didn't really let them be autonomous necessarily. And so you had the same sort of like guerrilla warfare tactics that the Philippines were using against the Spanish that they now begin to use against the United States. And ultimately with the idea here with the Philippines, when we negotiate the treaty, really the Philippine-American War is almost more of a misunderstanding than it is sort of a real war. I don't think the U.S. really has any desire to truly colonize the Philippines. We basically just wanted to build a naval base there and like work with and trade with the Filipino people in order to resupply our Navy and whatnot. Ultimately, the Philippines is sort of put into the status of U.S. protectorate. So it's sort of a territory of the United States that maintains some level of autonomy. Eventually, through sort of like political means, the Philippines are going to gain their independence in the middle of the 20th century. But ultimately, there's a sort of symbiotic relationship between the Philippines and the United States through most of that. And the Spanish-American War does, again, because around the same time, not that Hawaii was a part of it, but I mean, Hawaii is annexed in the middle of that in 1898. But the U.S. begins to see growth in sort of territories from Puerto Rico to possibly Cuba, to Guam, Hawaii, the Philippines. And so then the question sort of becomes like, what do we do, and how do we deal with these newfound opportunities, right? Which is really the thing. We are not the only ones that want to go or to want to be in Asia. Again, I told you earlier that China is this vast sort of open, untamed market. There's a ton of Chinese people. Good Lord, if we could just sell them crap, right? Like we get the Chinese to buy our crap, like it would be wonderful for us. But we're not the only country in the world that sort of sees that as a significant opportunity. And so the open door policy is basically an agreement by a bunch of white folk that say we're not going to like China is not going to become a protectorate of any white peoples, right? China is going to be its own independent autonomous nation, and China is going to have the ability to interact in the open market with basically everybody. Okay. Sino-Japanese War is a Russian-Japanese war that, again, because Russia is trying to get involved in East Asia as well. And there's some significant pushback from Asian peoples as to the sort of their willingness to interact with whites. But the Sino-Japanese War actually ends up getting Teddy Roosevelt a Nobel Peace Prize, right? He helps to negotiate the end of that and try to usher in a period of sort of global cooperation amongst all nations as it pertains to East Asia. But again, obviously, this is what you sort of need to understand about imperialism. Like when you talk about imperialism, it's literally like a bunch of white dudes dictating to minorities or to other ethnicities what they are or are not going to do on their ancestral lands, which is a little ridiculous if you think about it that way. The Boxer Rebellion is essentially a group of Chinese nationalists that are unhappy with foreign intervention in their country. They're ultimately put down. I mean, the Boxer Rebellion is ultimately put down by a whole bunch of white people and some collaboration amongst whites, and to a lesser degree, the Japanese. Because on some level, at like the turn of the 20th century, the Japanese see themselves as sort of like the America of Asia, right? Like the US gets to control the Western Hemisphere and Europe is just its own little like show. Like Europe is its own little theater where they fight and kill one another. Japan sort of has this idea like we're going to dominate Asia, like we'll control all of Asia. And so the Japanese actually help with putting down the Boxer Rebellion. Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy at this point is basically him utilizing the Navy. So that massive Navy that we built as a result of Mahan's theory, Roosevelt's idea, he actually takes it on like a world tour. Literally, he sails this massive U.S. Navy all over the globe, basically just to show it off, right? That's his big stick, okay? Roosevelt's idea is actually to walk softly but carry a big stick. So you don't want to run your mouth. You don't want to like you're not instigating fights. You're not picking fights. But if somebody picks a fight with you, you got a big old stick and you just whoop them, right? That's what Roosevelt's Navy is. Now, because we have this massive Navy, we also need to figure out how to get this Navy between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And there's no way to do that through the Western Hemisphere. So we're going to try to build the Panama Canal. The French had tried at some point. The U.S. ultimately sort of takes over. We also created the country of Panama in order to build the Panama Canal, because Panama was not a country prior to this point. It was a part of, what is it? Is it Colombia that's right there, or Venezuela? I forget. It's one of the two. But basically, the country, the Venezuela or Colombia, didn't want to sell some land to the U.S. or to the white people. They didn't want a canal being built through the country there. So we actually sort of created a little civil war, and we created Panama and made Panama its own country so that that we could ultimately build the Panama Canal, which is a massive technological feat. If you know anything about the Panama Canal, it's a lock and channel system. So there's actually a mountain range basically that runs through Panama, that runs right through Latin America there. So you actually have to get ships up like thousands of feet above sea level in order to get them over the mountains and back through. And so the way they do this is they basically have these massive locks, right? And a boat pulls in and then they flood the lock, and that obviously raises the boat because boats float, right? And so they flood it until it's level with the next one. Then they open the doors and they pull the boat through into the next one. And then they flood this one and it goes up, and you go across until you hit the peak. And then as you come down the other side, instead of flooding the lock, they basically pump all the water out and the boat sinks until it gets level with the next one, and then it goes forward. And it's actually quite the feat. Okay? The U.S. gets involved significantly in Latin America around this time. Yeah, there you go. The map shows me it was Colombia. That's what I thought. I thought it was Colombia. But Panama becomes a U.S. protectorate. Obviously, Cuba is sort of an American territory. American territory. We get involved in like Nicaragua and Haiti and a whole bunch of other places because the U.S. is trying to increase its wealth and its influence globally. The Russo-Japanese War, I think this is actually the one that Roosevelt got the, I guess this is 1905. This is the one Roosevelt got the Nobel Peace Prize for. But our relationship with Japan is again rather complex. Like I said, the Japanese sort of see themselves as the Asian equivalent of America, right? They're not necessarily they're somewhat accommodating to whites in the region, but they feel like they should be the dominant nation there. And so in 1904, the Japanese are actually the ones that attack the Russians because they see the Russians as being a little bit too ambitious and trying to overtake their sort of influence. The Japanese are actually unsuccessful there. They probably shouldn't have attacked the Russians at this point. They didn't really have the Navy and the sort of military capabilities to be successful yet. But ultimately, the U.S. is going to get involved in order to try to broker some sort of peace. And so we ultimately end up with this gentleman's agreement that's aimed at trying to limit the animosity that's existing at this point between whites and Asians. Okay. And then when you look at Taft and Wilson as we carry on into foreign policy, right? That little cartoon there is Teddy and his big stick. Taft's foreign policy is referred to as dollar diplomacy. So Taft is Roosevelt's successor. He's president after Roosevelt. He's basically going to pump U.S. currency and U.S. sort of economics into foreign territories in order to try to have some. Well, I mean, Taft is what I would probably use as my example if we're talking about American imperialism. And if you think that American imperialism exists, it's really that economic imperialism, right? Where we're trying to exert economic control, not necessarily political control, but economic control over other nations. And so that's sort of the idea there, right? And then Wilson's interventionism, Wilson sort of continues the idea of the U.S. getting involved in Latin America and Western Hemisphere issues. So we end up with troops in Mexico chasing Pancho Villa around in order to protect American economic investments in Mexico. But ultimately, it's sort of this idea of America protecting and expanding its economic influence globally, and specifically in the Western Hemisphere, more than it is any other type of imperialism. Like I would argue we're not really trying to lord over other people's. We're really just trying to exploit them economically. And when I say exploit, I don't necessarily mean like slave labor exploit, but just exploit in the terms of we're going to buy up your raw materials and we're going to sell you finished products at a significant markup, and we're going to make money off of you, right? So that's the end of 20. So this is really the foreign policy of the progressive era, right? And moving forward, we'll talk about some domestic policy of the progressive era, and then we'll talk about World War I before we have our next test. All right. I hate to do this to you. Your next test is on Friday, the 19th, which is a half day. So you're going to have to take that test on a half day at some point. Like, obviously, I don't expect you to do it in class because you're only going to be in here for like 25 minutes. But you're going to have to take it at some point in time that day, because I have to get it in the grade book that weekend, because that's the only way we're going to get 3 major grades in this 6-week grading period. All right. Wonderful. Any questions? No? Awesome. Any questions for you guys?